So now I have to... Signal. Okay, right. Thank you very much, Catherine, for the introduction, and also for inviting me. It's delightful to be here to speak to the Roman Society. So my title suggests that we should imagine Ovid himself as an Argonaut, journeying to Colchis alongside or instead of Jason. This is not as bizarre as it might at first seem. In Ex Ponto 1.4, he imagines just that. But he's even more heroic than Jason. He's suffered more at the hands of a more powerful ruler, travelled further in heroic isolation, unaccompanied, unhelped, without divine assistance, miraculous ship or legendary helmsman. Love damned him rather than helping him, and Ovid will not achieve his return. The Argonauts' cosmic exploration is provincial in comparison to Caesar's global rule. What Jason did with a team, made heroic by association, by sponsorship, Ovid does alone. This shows the Argonauts' achievement as their journey, especially the journey out. The Argonaut myth, then, has a peculiar poignancy for Ovid, who uses it as a measure of epic heroism, a measure which he surpasses. But how important is Ovid in the tradition of the Argonautic myth? What is distinctive about his contribution to the tradition? What does his treatment of the Argonaut myth tell us about Ovid as a poet and mythographer? I am in the midst of a perilous undertaking, a cultural history of the Argonaut myth, starting from the earliest scraps of image and text. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And here we got an early, a very interesting sort of variant from the visual tradition. What is happening to Jason there? He's just sort of being vomited or swallowed. And then one of the many sort of visual versions of the Argo. And this is just one instance of how the Argonaut myth gets used in the later tradition, as in the California Gold Rush, where it was a very sort of prominent image of exploration and the acquisition of wealth. And here are a couple of the most recent versions, one in fantasy, one in science fiction. The left-hand one melds Ovid and Medea and Merlin, and the right-hand one does Medea as a genomancer. So they're both very interesting texts. So I'm going right up to the most recent versions, appropriations and reworking. I'm attempting to sketch out the landmarks on the journey and the stretches of water in between. Accidents of survival and the contingency of reception continually intrude. We lack the early Argonaut epic, to which the Odyssey gestures. Varro's Argonautica, was it wholly a translation of Apollonius? Ovid's Medea. Of the material that survives, Euripides' Medea and Apollonius' Argonautica dominate much of the tradition. Existing studies of the tradition focus on the reception of Euripides, but there was a long period of time when Latin texts were very much more widely known and read, in the West at least, than Greek texts. For Maffeo Vegio, who was born in 1407 in Lodi, and there's an image of Maffeo Vegio and a picture of Lodi, near Milan, writing his hexameter works in 1430-38, neither Apollonius nor Valerius form the dominating text of the tradition. He's best known for his supplementum, the 13th book of the Aeneid, but he also wrote a Vellus Aureum in 1431, which is a Latin hexameter epic in 4 books, totaling about 1,000 lines. And Valerius Flaccus wasn't rediscovered until 1427, and so it's just about possible that he might have had a bit of a look at Valerius Flaccus, and I think there might be some evidence of him having seen the proem, but not very much. He also seems to have known a little bit about Apollonius, particularly in the catalogue, but the focus is on Medea as lover. And certainly it's the case that he was using Ovid, who's very interested in Ovid, and he was sort of inserting himself into the tradition of the bit that Ovid didn't look at as much. Before what happens with Seneca, so it's focused on the Argonautic bit of the myth rather than the Corinthian bit. So Ovid might well be more important in the Argonautic tradition than one would expect. Where and how do we encounter the Argonaut myth in Ovid's works? Well, already in the Heroides, Ovid is establishing his credentials as a writer of myth, a poet that comments on and plays with the existing mythic traditions. Jason is lucky enough to receive 2 letters in the collection, Heroides 6 from Hypsipyle and Heroides 12 from Medea. Characteristically, the female perspective focuses on the male hero. And the Metamorphoses is in some ways more radical. In Met 7 to 424, it's all Medea's. And then I also want to have a quick look at Tristia 3:9, which uses the story of Absyrtus to define the barbaric nature of Thomis. Another aspect of the Argonautic tradition which has become clear to me is the importance of mythography. For William Morris, for instance, and this is another one of the bits of the Argonaut myth that I'm particularly interested in, his Life and Death of Jason, the dictionary of Lempriere was influential. Morris's daughter May, in her introduction to the collected works, claimed that Morris used no other authorities than nursery tales and works of reference, such as Lempriere's dictionary, with occasional hints from Ovid and Apollonius. May Morris seems to include both Apollonius and Ovid within the corpus of mythography. So where do we draw the line between a sort of literary text and a reference work? You know, is the Metamorphoses, in some senses, a mythography? And Ovid is hugely important in children's literature, particularly in recent years, as Deborah Roberts has shown, particularly in the way the Metamorphoses dominates the collections of Greek myth. So let's have a look at Heroides 6. In this poem, Hypsipyle plays with the Argonautic myth as she first presents ideal versions of Jason and herself as desired, desirable and happy couple, then turns the tables to become a second Medea, setting Medea herself as her curse against Jason. The poem begins with Hypsipyle's complaint that Jason has not sent news to her. She's heard from rumour about the events at Colchis, a story that puts the heroic responsibility for those events into the passive. And this is the next item on the handout, 6:10 to 14. Right. She heard that the bulls sacred to Mars had received the curving yoke, that the scattering of the seed there sprang forth the harvest of men, who for their doom had no need of your right arm, that the spoil of the ram, the deep gold fleece, the unsleeping dragon guarded, had nevertheless been stolen away by your bold hand. It's worth pointing out, though, that the 40 Manu, the strong hand, is not actually specifically Jason's. Jason's hand wasn't needed to kill the same men, and it could have been Medea's, who had taken the fleece. There's no mention of Medea, suggesting a version in which Jason takes all the glory. And we might think back to Pindar's version in Pythian 4. Hypsipyle next presents an image of herself as the sort of ideal audience of the Argonautic story, told by an anonymous Thessalian, a Dido combined with a Penelope, hearing about her long-lost husband and the epic tales featuring the heroic lover she desires. This is the next item on the handout. And when calm of mind had returned, I began to ask of your fortunes. He tells me of the brazen-footed oxen of Mars, how they ploughed at the serpent's teeth scattered upon the ground, etc., etc. While part by part he tells the tale, such, in the rushing eagerness of his speech, is his unconscious art, that he lays bare my wounds. The unnamed Thessalian narrator, as presented by Hypsipyle here, is careful to keep all the stories in the passive, to obscure the fact that Jason's deeds were not necessarily down to Jason. So Hypsipyle can present herself as the adoring, desiring wife who hangs on every word of her husband's heroic story. But in fact, she knows all about Medea. And actually, this is not a love letter, it is a curse. As the second half of the letter deconstructs the first half, she presents a different version of the Argonautic myth with the focus on the deeds of Medea. For Hypsipyle, Medea is a powerful witch, holding Jason by virtue of her incantations. This allows her to soften for herself the pain of his abandonment. So surely she must have forced you to bear the yoke, just as she forced the bulls, and had you subdued by the same means she uses with fierce dragons. Cleverly, Hypsipyle suggests that the alteration of the tradition from Pindar's heroic Jason to Euripides' heroic Medea is down to Medea herself. The wife obscures the glory of the husband. Yet it is her power that also explains her subjugation of Jason. This creates a nice cognitive dissonance, a sort of disavowal. She even imagines the hostile political reception of those who favour Peleus. The two traditions undermine each other, and Hypsipyle herself is not the only one who is manipulating the variations of the myth. So if we move on to look at Heroides 12, Medea's letter begins abruptly, evoking the start of Euripides' Medea, with a wish that none of this had ever happened, which blossoms into a sort of anti-Argonautica. As you can see. So she wishes undone the Argo's departure, its arrival, her first sight of Jason, and then she imagines Jason burnt without her help or cut down by the earthborn men. Gradually, next, Medea narrates the story of their love affair, closely following the account in Apollonius, interspersed with references to her present situation, such as, "Traitor, you saw it, for who can well hide love? Its flame shines forth its own betrayer." So she's assuming that he was taking advantage of her and deliberately manipulating her emotional connection. Her narration focuses on her feelings, Jason's concerns at the time, to emphasise how important she was then and how little he should be thinking about his current love interest now. She tells the story in the second person. "You yoke together the bronze-footed bulls with your body unharmed by their fire, and cleave the solid mould with the share as you were bidden. The ploughed fields you sow full with envenomed teeth in place of seed," etc. This narration resembles nothing more than a choose-your-own-adventure story, as if Jason can now choose whether Medea will kill her brother and his children, or not. And it is appropriately followed by a typically tendentious reference to a very varied part of the Argonautic tradition, the return journey. "Would the Symplegades had caught and crushed us together," I've got the Symplegades really sort of stand in for the whole Argonautic expedition, and this is a concept drawing by Harryhausen for the 1963 movie Jason and the Argonauts. And then I just also found, oh no, I didn't put that one on, so I won't. I thought I found a really cool one on DeviantArt as well, but there we go. Right. The Symplegades feature on the outward journey, where they are fixed forever after the Argonauts pass through them in Apollonius, and they encounter Scylla and Charybdis on the return journey. Medea's reference to the Symplegades then seems rather confused. They can't have taken both routes home. It's like she's sort of living in the mythic universe rather than in a sort of narrative linear version. But it sort of does work psychologically. Because she could quite happily wish that the Argonauts had been crushed in their sort of emblematic mythic moment of going through the Symplegades, even if she wouldn't have been there at the time. Medea here seems keen to give the Argonauts as much epic capital as possible in order to increase the importance of her own achievements. She melds together the Apollonian and Euripidean traditions to put herself in the centre of the action. So moving on to the Metamorphoses, Book 7 presents a very different Medea, focusing on the transformation of love and the transformative power of witchcraft. Again, Ovid passes over the major part of the Argonauts' achievement, the journey to Colchis, which is only marginally of interest to Medea, and that's number 8 on your handout. The narrative of Medea falling in love with Jason slots in elements not present in the Heroides 12 narrative. Instead of his speech to her in the temple, we have her reaction to it. So it's as if the two texts are talking to each other. They sort of take two parts of the dialogue. And in the detailed description of Jason's feats, Medea's herbs protect Jason, and Medea's incantations keep him safe while he throws the boulder amongst the earthborn men. So it's still a very, the agency is very much given to Medea. It's Jason himself, however, who uses her magic to sprinkle sleep on the dragon, and that is quite different from the existing version, sort of more like Pindar again. The return journey of the Argonauts is even more abbreviated, as you can see at number 9 on the handout. Instead, the Metamorphoses version focuses on Medea's journey. So we don't get the Argonauts' journeys, their heroism, we get Medea's instead. First, as she goes in search of the ingredients for the rejuvenation of Ison at 219-34, and then as she flees from the murder of Peleus. So I've given you the first bit on the handout, And you can see her sailing over Thessaly. She saw the Vale of Tempe, where the level soil is widely covered with a crumbling chalk. She turned her dragons towards the new regions there, and she observed the herbs by Ossa born, the weeds on lofty Pelion, Othris, Pindus, and vast Olympus. And you can see the verbs of vision, day spigot, perspicit. Her controlling, acquisitive gaze resembles that of Jupiter repairing his realm after the fall of Phaethon. At 350 to 90, she passes over numerous metamorphoses as she views the landscape on her way from Pelias to Corinth. And Medea's journeys then replace the Argonauts' journeys as the object of interest, the heroic achievement, and the method of viewing the landscape and taking control of the world around. She becomes a focalizer of the narrative, even a narrator figure in her divine chariot, which apparently she has on call all the time, very handy, arguably a sort of chariot of song. This radically displaces the Argonaut myth away from both Euripides and Apollonius. Obviously, there are other tragedies that dealt with the death of Pelias, so it's still very much in sort of well-travelled area of myth. One element that stays constant in nearly all of Ovid's version is his portrayal of the death of Absyrtus in Heroides 6. Hypsipyle would have sent her children to Jason, but she fears Medea as a stepmother. Passage 11 on the handout. It was Medea I feared, Medeam timui. Would she who could tear her brother limb from limb and strew him o'er the fields be one to spare my pledges? And that, I think, raises this quite interesting idea of Absyrtus as a possible hostage. Should she have held on to him and used him as a bargaining chip? I think you can see a sort of whole new sort of novel coming out of there. In Heroides 12, Medea, like Virgil's Daedalus, is unable to narrate the death of Absyrtus. But thee, O my brother, I did not leave behind as I fled. In this one place my pen fails. Of the deed my right hand was bold enough to do, it is not bold enough to write. So I, too, should have been torn limb for limb, but with thee. And yet I did not fear. For what after that could I fear, to trust myself to the sea woman though I was, and now with guilt upon me? And this scene is very popular in later reception. And here's a version by Draper, and you can see, well, he's not actually being torn limb from limb here, but he is being sort of torn, and quite what they're going to do with him, it's not entirely clear. They're certainly going to throw him in the sea. The tradition that Medea killed her brother and scattered the parts of his body on the sea or the landscape in order to slow down Aeetes' pursuit is an old one, dating back at least to Heroides, about the mid-5th century BC, and Sophocles as well. This is the version that features in Euripides' Medea. It is diametrically opposed to the version of Apollonius, in which Absyrtus is an adult who is betrayed by Medea, who leads him into an ambush for Jason to kill him. Ovid in Tristia 3.9 puts his main emphasis on the myth as the etiology of the name Thomis, from the Greek verb temno. Apollodorus also alludes to this etymology, and that text may have been before or after Ovid, so it's actually quite hard to place exactly what's going on, but probably the tradition of the etiology already existed. So it's hard to separate Ovid out from other mythographical traditions, although Hyginus follows Apollonius' version, and Valerius' text breaks off before that particular aspect of the story. But he generally seems to be following Apollonius, so Absyrtus is an adult. So Tristia 3.9 is an important narrative version of Medea's murder and dismemberment of the child Absyrtus, and possibly the most important in classical Latin. This is not quite the I'm going to read you a bit of it. When aware of his presence, she exclaimed, "The victory is mine, his death shall save me." So she realises her father is chasing him. She decides she's going to kill her brother. Forthwith, while he in his ignorance feared no such attack, this is Absyrtus, she pierced his innocent side with a hard sword. Then she tore him limb from limb, scattering the fragments of his body throughout the fields, so that they must be sought in many places. And to appraise her father, she placed upon a lofty rock the pale hands and gory head. Thus was the sire delayed by his fresh grief lingering while he gathered those lifeless limbs on a journey of sorrow. So was this place called Tomis, because here, they say, the sister cut to pieces her brother's body. This is not quite the most brutal version of the death of Absyrtus, as Medea has not deliberately brought him with her for this purpose, but it presents him as a precursor of her innocent children, unaware of the death approaching him, and characterises the brutality of Ovid's place of exile, and the poem immediately afterwards is all about the horrible weather in Tomis. It is clear that Ovid is very important in Maffeo Veggio's version of the Argonaut myth. His poem comes to a climax with the death of Absyrtus, the second half of Book 4, just as the Aeneid ends with the death of Turnus, and Virgil is also extremely important in Maffeo Vegio. And Vegio gives a clear intertextual nudge with a reference to Tomis itself. So Medea, spurred by such madness, rouses herself and buries her sword, it's interesting that he uses condit there, in her brother's entrails. She beheads him and divides his limbs in halves, and fleeing abandons them in the land of Tomis. Medea here is even more brutal than she is in Ovid's Tristia, planning his death in advance, and we've got that. Anticipating in her wiliness a criminal act of such monstrosity, she had brought him with her, nor did the fact that he was her sweet young brother enter into her evil planning. And so we've got the infantia next to the mentem there. Even so, she hesitates. So we have, on one hand, she's more brutal. On the other hand, she's sort of less likely to do it. She's about to change her mind. She's not going to kill him after all. But she's made to do the act by the intervention of Tisiphone. And that feels a little bit sort of Flavian in some ways. We can also see a good example of the influence of Ovid, which unfortunately I didn't put on the handout, is a bit where Veggio's Tisiphone is trying to persuade Medea that she should do it after all, and echoes that bit from Heroides 12 where Medea wishes that she had herself had been torn limb for limb. And Veggio says, "Or are you waiting for your father savagely to scatter across the field's breadth your limbs, which he has ripped apart, and for a father's impious right hand to claim from you the bloody death at which you shudder in the case of your little brother?" So it's this really interesting idea of Medea and Aeetes competing to be Medea. And that is what convinces her to go for it after all. So Maffeo Veggio's version of the Argonaut myth takes a fundamentally Ovidian approach to the whole story, liberally mixed with Seneca and Virgil, and draws together the different versions from across the Ovidian corpus. He shows how important Ovid was at this stage in the tradition. Let us finish with a thought experiment. What if all classical literature and art had been destroyed except for the works of Ovid? What sort of Argonaut myth would we have if we reconstructed it entirely from the Ovidian corpus? Would it have been torn limb from limb? First, it would be clear that it was an important myth, since he refers to it on numerous occasions and expects his audience to know and remember it, and to know varied versions of it as well. Heroides 12 would give us an outline of the major events of the story in Colchis, but it would be Medea's story, not Jason's. Met 7 would suggest that the most important part was the rejuvenation of Aeson and the death of Peleus. Apart from Hypsipyle's description of the departure from Lemnos, the outwards journey would have more or less disappeared. Many details would look uncertain or confusing as Ovid plays with multiple traditions. We would be keenly aware of the rhetoric in different retellings of myth, as agency, responsibility, and achievement are redistributed at will. The different fragments, the different parts, each tendentious in their own way, would complicate and undermine each other. This is Ovidian mythography, which, while it seems superficially consistent for the most part, and the way he sort of deals with different bits and fits them together is quite ingenious, is the reverse of a helpful handbook, which sets all the stories in order and explains them, laying out all the possible different versions or defining them as one canonical version. And yet, Ovid's versions are the ones that survive. And this is where I've got a couple of illustrations from children's literature where you can see that it's really quite surprising, given that you'd expect children's literature to sort of sanitize these stories. But in lots of ways, it's the Absyrtus, the death of Absyrtus, that dominates this part of the story. And here we actually can see the little limbs being chucked into the waves by Medea in that version. Ovid's versions are the ones that survive that dominate traditions of anthologies of Greek myth for children, where many encounter the ancient world for the first time. There's something intrinsically appropriate about Ovid's unhelpful mythography that sums up the nature of Greco-Roman myth. Thank you very much.